So in this video, I will be talking about my experiences at my first job, working as an usher for Cineplex Entertainment. Passionately providing an exceptional entertainment experience. So this company runs, well, not all, but most of the theaters in this country, and I worked there from around 2006 to around the end of 2007. So what does an usher do? Well, the first thing you see when you walk into a theater is likely the box office, where people sell tickets. That wasn't my job. The next thing you see is the concession, where you buy your overpriced popcorn and drinks. That was an area where I was occasionally asked to help out with, but that also wasn't my job. Then there was the management, and of course the projectionist, who was basically a hermit. And then there are ushers who basically do everything else. As a customer, your first and likely only interaction with an usher is when you go to the gate and there's a guy taking your tickets, or scanning your tickets as it's usually done nowadays. So we call this being on door. You'd sit at your little podium, people would come up to you with your tickets, you'd look down on it and you'd rip it off, part of it, and say, Spider-Man, Theater 3, right behind me. And if it was a really busy day, you'd be saying things like that over and over and over, sometimes for up to an hour. So you'd start out saying things like Spider-Man Theater 3, but after a short while that would turn into something like You weren't supposed to spend too much time there, but hey, sometimes things were busy and no one was around to replace you. And part of being on door meant that you were the one person that customers would talk to if they had an issue. And let me tell you, nothing is as soul-killing or as frustrating as having to deal with problems that you simply cannot resolve. For example, customers would often come up to me and say, this theater, this movie, it's too loud. And I would have to say, well, it's the studio that sets the volume levels, we can't do anything about it. Or this one woman who complained that the wheelchair seating in the theater was too close to the screen and it was forcing her husband to crane his neck upward just to watch the movie. And yeah, that really sucks, but I can't rebuild the entire theater. Or somebody would come to me and say, this movie, I think it was The Bourne Ultimatum, it's too shaky, everything's jittering, and well, that's just how the movie was shot. I can't change that. Of course, some complaints were a little more ignorant, like when the movie Pan's Labyrinth came out, it was not uncommon to have people come out and say, like, no one told me this movie was in goddamn Latin or something. Yes, somebody actually said that to me. The movie is in Spanish, by the way. Or people who would bring their kids to the film not realizing that Pan's Labyrinth is not a children's movie. Fun times. Of course, being an usher wasn't just about being on door. There was also theater checks. Basically, every half hour, you had to walk through each of the theaters and make sure that the picture was in focus, that it wasn't out of rack, that is, the projector is actually showing the full frame and not like half of one frame and half of another, and that no one was, camming the movie or anything like that, or being unruly. That was pretty quiet. People in the theater usually didn't do anything too crazy. Then, of course, we had to clean the theaters after each showing, and that was where the trouble began. You see, the proper way that we were told to clean the theaters was you had to have somebody take a push broom, shove all the rubbish to the end, and then somebody would scoop it up and put it into the one of those big Rubbermaid brute bins. But the problem was, this was a very slow process, and we had 12 theaters and maybe 2 or 3 ushers responsible for cleaning the theaters, and sometimes you didn't have a lot of time to get those theaters clean, like sometimes as short as a few minutes. So we obviously didn't have time to do things the proper way, so somebody came up with the idea of just taking your brooms, running down the aisles, sweeping all the rubbish underneath the seats because that was the only way we could get the job done on time. And of course, sometimes you'd find trinkets and other stuff left behind by customers. Occasionally these would be things like unopened bottles, or like unopened bottles of Coke, or unopened packages of candy. That was always nice, but sometimes you'd see things like half-empty bottles of liquor that they had smuggled in. Or one time, one of the ushers stumbled across a bottle of oxycodone, and the procedure was that if you found something like that, you had to take it to the management immediately. But this usher was like, no, I think I'll keep it for myself and maybe try a few of these pills. So, the next day, we all ask him about it, and he's like, yeah, I tried taking some of it, and then I couldn't move. Yeah, that was a memorable day, let me tell you. So you take your bags of garbage, put them into this big cart in the storage room, and then at the end of the night, you take that cart out to the trash compactor. And let me tell you, I soon grew to despise the smell of Coca-Cola and butter, because that's what our garbage smelled like, and now I just mentally associate that smell with garbage. But I haven't gotten to the worst part of this job, and that was washroom checks. You see, every half hour, not only did you have to do theater checks, you also had to do washroom checks. And at this job, I learned that if people have no expectation of having to clean up for themselves, they will gladly leave the most disgusting messes imaginable. So, our washrooms had those type of faucets where you have to push down on it to get water and then it shuts off after a few seconds. So, what people would do is, they'd come in, they'd push the faucet, wash their hands a little bit, and then it would shut off. So they'd reach up, push it again, wash their hands a little bit more, and so on and so on. And this would cause water to be splashed all over the counter. So every time you went in for a washroom check, the counter would be swamped with water and be dripping on the floor, and you had to be the one to clean it up. And I distinctly recall wiping up this huge puddle of water, and one of the customers comes up to me and says, "What a shitty job, man." And I'm like, yeah, and that's not discounting and that's not to mention the actual, literal shit you had to deal with, because twice, a customer decided to shit into the garbage bin. I don't know why, I don't know if it was the same person each time, but they did, and it was a bad day. Another thing that happened to me twice, which almost made me want to quit, was someone or a group of people unscrewed the soap bottles from underneath the counter and flung the soap all over the washroom, and guess who got the job of cleaning it up? Yes, that was me, and that was also a bad day. Now, there was one other job that involved helping the projectionist move film prints between one projector and another, and some context here because this ultimately leads into one of the greatest screw-ups I witnessed while working there. So, today, most projectors, I imagine, are digital, and movies come on something called a DCP, or Digital Cinema Package. But back in my day, our films came on 35mm film prints, which is how movies should be shown, damn it! Anyway, they'd come in these octagonal metal crates from the distributor, and they would be divided up into these 20-minute reels or so. So once you got the movie prints, you'd have to take them up to the projector, and they'd build them together into this big, huge, like almost a meter wide reel. Now, the projector that we use in a theater isn't like how people typically imagine a projector with the two metal reels that are upright. No, we used a series of horizontal platters that was called a cake stand. And basically, you lay the film on one of these platters, and there's a device in the center called the brain, and it picks up the film, it runs it through the projector, and then it gets spooled out onto the take-up platter. Then when you want to play the movie again, you just move the brain down to the old take-up platter and then rethread the projector, and away you go. So there's no rewinding or anything. This system basically allowed theaters to have, multiple cinemas that could be operated by just one projectionist, as opposed to the old day where you'd have to have the projectionist switching between the reels every 20 minutes or so. Now, of course, films had to be moved between the projectors every now and then, and you would have to hold this gigantic film reel out on your hands, out on your arms, and if you dropped it and it became unspooled, you were basically going to have to cancel a showing for that time block, because there's no way the projectionist is going to be able to get it back together again. Now, here is where the big screw-up happened. So, as I said, films came from the distributor in these big metal crates, and the procedure was that as soon as they arrive, you need to take them up to the projection booth to get them built up and ready for a showing. However, one of the ushers didn't know this, so we get all these film prints, and he's like, what do I do with these? I know. I'm going to go take them and drop them off right outside the cash office. This was exactly the wrong thing to do, because the cash office was where we sent movies that are going back. So we get this movie, it was Hairspray, that musical with John Travolta. So we get Hairspray, and the usher puts it outside the cash office, and then it gets sent back to the distributor. And then all of a sudden, it's Friday. We're debuting Hairspray, and all of a sudden we realize, oops, we have no movie. Yes, a lot of refunds issued, let me tell you. And then there is the next screw-up, which is just outright horrific. So, at the end of the day, like, we had a fry machine, right? At the end of the day, someone at the concession had to take that fry grease and emptied it into these jugs so they could be sent away for recycling. So one of the employees who didn't understand the procedure, he goes to empty the frying machine of grease right after switching it off when it's still hot. So he pours the hot fry oil into the big plastic jugs. He reaches down to pick one of them up. The bottom melts out, sending hot oil all over the floor. He freaks out and tries to get away. He slips and falls on his back into the hot fry oil. So I'm working on door, right? And all of a sudden I hear this shouting from concession, "Get it off, get it off, get it off, get it off." And when I run in there, there's this, when I eventually get back there, he's like, he's like shivering in a corner. His shirt is off. The managers are pouring cold water down his back to try to cool his burns. And oh boy, that was an extremely bad day. And guess who got the job of cleaning up several liters worth of oil? That's right, me. Do you know how hard it is to clean up several liters worth of frying oil? Ugh. Now, you might be asking, what was the worst movie you had to work through? Like, what movie had the worst patrons? Well, usually I'd say children's movies because children always made a mess in the theater. But in terms of annoying customers, the worst movie had to be 300. So there I was, working the release day of 300, and I'm in the theater before opening, and there's already a crowd gathered outside the front doors. Like, really? Is 300 such a great movie that you actually have to, like, line up before opening? Anyway, so I take my keys from the key box and jauntily stroll over to the front door and unlock it, only for one of the customers to grab the door, like yank it out of my hands, push me aside, nearly like knocking me on my back, and then rush into the theater because he just had to be the first person in line to see 300. And the worst movie in terms of the actual quality of the film itself that we ran during my tenure there, well, that had to be Epic Movie. It was one of those god-awful seltzer burger films that are sort of like genre parodies like Airplane or Naked Gun, but they're absolutely terrible. Like, all they do is just reshoot popular films and then replace scenes with pop cultural references that are going to be incredibly dated within a year or two. As for the movie that had the most people I saw walking out of it, that would have to be Borat, believe it or not. A lot of people, I guess they didn't really understand what sort of movie it was going in, and they were really dismayed to find out that it was an incredibly crude, cringe comedy. So, what was the best part of working as an usher at Cineplex Entertainment, you might be wondering? Well, I'd have to say the best part was working with standees. Those are those large displays used to promote movies. A lot of them were just these simple cardboard displays, but some of them were more elaborate. Like, when Fantastic Four: The Rise of the Silver Surfer came out, we actually built this standee that was a life-size replica of the Silver Surfer. And when the Simpsons movie came out, there was this big display, again life-size, of the Simpsons family sitting on a couch. It was so complex to assemble that it actually came with a DVD instructional video telling us how to build it. Now, the more complex standees like the ones I just mentioned, those had to go back to the distributor, but the smaller, simpler cardboard ones, they just told us to throw them in the garbage. Of course, they were too large to fit in the garbage compactor, so instead, we had to disassemble them. And by disassemble, I mean we beat the shit out of them with our broomsticks, because sometimes, after a stressful day, you just want to let off some steam by beating a standee to death with a broom. At one point, we even came up with the idea of having one of the employees run over the standees with his truck. That was good times. And of course, when it comes to good times, I can't forget playing Xbox 360 games on a movie screen using the digital projector they use for the pre-show. Let me tell you, there's nothing quite like playing video games on a movie screen. And of course, we got a free movie pass once every pay period or 2 weeks, although I never really used that as much as I could have, simply because my line of thinking was, well, I work here all the time, and if I have a day off, do I really want to spend it back at the place where I work? As for whether or not this is something I would consider a good job, well, it was definitely a job of extremes. It could be really good one day and absolutely awful the next day. Like, the worst was during Boxing Week, right? Where a lot of employees were on vacation, so we were always short-staffed, and there were a lot of big movies coming out, and a lot of people were on vacation, so they decided to come down to the theater. And it was insanely busy, like thousands of people coming through there every day, and one particularly memorable moment that I wasn't there for, but which I heard about later, was it was so busy, and the usher staff was so preoccupied that they didn't do their half-hour washroom checks, and thus the toilets ran out of toilet paper. So a customer goes to use the washroom, goes to take a dump, right, and then he realizes to his horror that after he's done, there's no toilet paper in the reel. So, out of desperation, he rips up his underwear and uses that to wipe, and when he goes to use the sink to wash his hands, he discovers that there's no soap in the dispenser. That complaint went all the way up to head office in Toronto, and you better believe we heard about it at the next staff meeting. So yes, that was a very, very terrible day, but there were also days where you could just chill with your coworkers, and for the most part, my coworkers were pretty cool people that were fun to hang out with, and that really is the most important thing about job satisfaction. Not the work itself necessarily, but your coworkers. Good coworkers can make a bad job bearable, while bad coworkers can make it a living hell. So that's the story of me working at Cineplex Entertainment as a minimum wage usher. And I think I learned a lot from this job. Like any customer-facing job, it really makes you appreciate what customer service employees have to go through, and it makes you a little more empathetic to their position and a little less likely to act like some obnoxious Karen. Anyway, that's all for today, everyone. See you next time.